Hello and welcome to Unacademy IAS English, a one-stop destination for the English medium civil services aspirants. US President Biden has shocked both Putin and Trump with a major decision that could impact the future course of Russia-Ukraine war. The United States has decided to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles provided by the United States against Russia to strike targets deep inside Russian territory. So this is indeed a big development and marks a major escalation in the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict. This could have serious implications for Trump's presidency, as Trump would inherit a much more complicated war, and it definitely crosses a red line for Russia, and Putin could see this as a provocative step. So in this short video, let's quickly analyze these developments and understand the rationale behind this decision which has been taken by US President Biden. See, Ukraine has been receiving a lot of military assistance from the Western countries since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. The NATO countries, particularly the European members, have provided funds and weapons to Ukraine to aid its war efforts. But United States has been the key backer of Ukraine in this conflict. And over the last couple of years, Ukraine has requested for advanced weaponry from US and its NATO allies. For example, Ukraine had requested for F-16 fighter jets, the HIMAR artillery rocket system, the Abrams tanks, and as well as other advanced weaponry. But each time, the US would initially consider the request, but it would hold on to the approval because the US didn't want these steps to be seen as escalatory or provocatory step by Russia. Because if US was directly involved in providing advanced weaponry to Ukraine, which eventually Ukraine would use to target Russia, the fear was Russia might escalate and Russia might even start retaliating against NATO members in Europe, which could drag US and the NATO members into a much bigger, wider conflict, as NATO members are obligated to provide collective defense as per Article 5 of NATO's treaty, that is the Washington Treaty which established the NATO. So to avoid such possible escalation, US would initially hold on to the decision before providing approval for such critical weapon systems. But eventually, the US approved the supply of these critical weapon systems that has aided Ukraine in its war efforts against Russia. So similarly, one request from Ukraine was for the delivery of ATACMS, Army Tactical Missile Systems, which are long-range advanced missile systems. They have a range of close to 300 kilometers, which means Ukraine could use them to target deep targets located inside Russian territory. And Ukraine had been requesting for the Army Tactical Missile Systems from a long time. But as always, the US held on to the decision and it delayed the approval. But eventually, the US had supplied these missiles in secret and transported them to Ukraine. But it hadn't granted the approval for Ukraine to use them against Russia in the ongoing conflict. So now, US has not only supplied these missiles over the course of last few months, but President Biden has granted approval to Ukraine to start using them as well in the conflict, and this could mark a new phase of this war. So let's understand why this decision has been taken. Doesn't this mark a major escalation? Because now Russia, if it were to see this as a provocative step, and if it were to retaliate not just against Ukraine, but maybe even against the NATO members in Europe, this could drag the US into a much bigger conflict, or it could push Russia to get even more aggressive against Ukraine with disastrous consequences for Ukraine. So what explains this decision of Biden? So let's break this down. See, in the recent presidential elections, Donald Trump, during the presidential campaign, he insisted that the US should not be involved in the Russia-Ukraine war. Donald Trump has often followed an inward-looking conservative policy focused on making America first or prioritizing American interests over foreign interests. Trump has often criticized American military aid which amounts to billions of dollars, which has been given to Ukraine. And Trump has also been openly critical of NATO and its members who haven't contributed enough to NATO's war efforts in Ukraine. Trump's argument is the US is forced eventually to take up the higher share of the burden, whereas other NATO members contribute very little. And according to Trump, this contradicts American interests, particularly American economic and military interests. So Trump had sworn that if he is elected as the next president, that he would end this war in one day. Even though he never came out with the concrete solution or proposed a peace plan, he was very confident that if elected as a president, he would end this war, which basically meant that he would stop the military aid to Ukraine and allow Russia-Ukraine to decide the end of the conflict on their own terms, which would have essentially served Russian interests, and it would have compromised Ukrainian interests and as well as the interests of European countries and NATO allies. Now, this statement of Trump and this approach of Trump towards Ukraine was seen as compromising American interests as well, American foreign policy and security interests. So this is something that caused a lot of concern for Zelensky and European leaders, and even for the Democrat Party in the US and for current President Biden, because they all believe that American interests and Western interests are protected only when they continue backing Ukraine by providing military funding and weapons to stand up against the Russian aggression. But Trump doesn't believe in that. He opposes the continued aid to Ukraine. He sees this as a drain on American wealth and American resources. He believes this is largely a European war, and European countries who are members of NATO, they should be providing more assistance to Ukraine and not United States. So this is something that had been causing concern for Ukraine, European leaders, and as well as for US President Biden. So Russia and Ukraine both were closely watching the US presidential elections. They were preparing for both possible outcomes, whether it would be Kamala Harris or Trump as the next president. Both Zelensky and Putin were making plans and preparing for the last several months so that they could protect their interests and emerge victorious in this conflict. See, Russia, after invading the country in 2022, it initially made a lot of gains and captured significant Ukrainian territory. For example, you can see here in this map how Russia captured Ukrainian territory across southern and eastern Ukraine. It had already captured Crimean Peninsula back in 2014, but after the start of the invasion in 2022, it has gained control over these parts of eastern and southern Ukraine, stretching from the Donbas region to Mariupol. So after making these advances, Russia has seen a stagnation. Russian military forces have largely been exhausted. They have been running out of weapons as well. And this has been Western intelligence assessment, that Russian forces are struggling to provide for the required logistics and resources to bring in the required number of troops to maintain the gains, the territorial gains, in order to claim victory in this war. So Russia has also been looking for ways to exit the war, possibly through a peace treaty, but it wants to ensure that it captures as much territory as possible in Ukraine, especially before the US presidential elections. So before the next president comes in from January 2025, Russia's aim was to capture as much territory as possible and change the status quo, because the war had hit a stalemate due to Russia's weakness and its lack of preparedness within the military. Russia even ended up relying on Iran and China and eventually North Korea in order to sustain this war. While Iran and China supplied weapons to assist Russia in the war, North Korea has even supplied thousands of troops along with arms and weapons to assist the Russian war efforts in Ukraine. So given the weakening position of Russia in terms of its military strength and capabilities to defeat Ukraine in the battlefield, Russia was looking for large territorial gains through aggressive military action in the run-up to the US presidential elections, so that even if a peace plan is pushed and Russia-Ukraine accept the peace plan, Russia can still claim victory by retaining the territory captured from Ukraine. That has been Russian strategy. So no wonder you see a sudden surge in Russian deadly attacks using drones, targeted glide vehicles and fighter jets, through which Russia has mounted major attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure in the recent months. In fact, Ukraine, on the other hand, also has a similar strategy in place. In the run-up to elections, Ukraine mounted a major offensive to try and reverse the gains of Russia, and it tried to capture territory on its own and recover some of the lost territory so that it could be in a better position if at all peace talks are held under the next US president. Because both Russia and Ukraine are very clear, they are very certain that very soon the war might come to an end, maybe next year, and the future US president would determine the course of the war and would play a pivotal role in any peace talks between Russia and Ukraine. So be it Trump or be it Kamala Harris, both sides were preparing for this eventuality, and their approach was to capture as much territory as possible. Russia was trying to increase its gains by going on a fresh offensive with support from its allies, whereas Ukraine was trying to reduce the losses and take some more territory in order to push Russia back, so that both sides could use this as a bargaining chip, as a trade-off in an eventual peace talk. So now, after the US presidential elections, we will witness a major shift happening in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, because Ukraine delivered a major blow to Russia in the run-up to US presidential elections. Just months before US presidential elections in August, Ukraine carried out a major upset. It secured a huge battlefield victory by attacking Russia by launching this surprise invasion in the strategic Kursk region. And Ukraine ended up capturing this Russian territory, which became a bargaining chip for Ukraine. So experts and analysts were predicting that in any future peace negotiations, Ukraine will use the Kursk region, which it has captured from Russia, as a bargaining chip, as a trade-off, in order to get back the captured territories in the south and east of Ukraine. If Russia has retained hold over Donbas region, Crimea, and southern parts of Ukraine, Ukraine's plan was to take Russian territory, a large strategic area in the Kursk region, which could be used as a bargaining chip, as a trade-off to secure its territory back from Russia. And Ukraine delivered this battlefield victory, which shocked Russia in the month of August. Since then, Russia has been desperately trying to take back the Kursk region, and it has even launched a major offensive in the Kharkiv region to mount pressure on Ukraine. So the battlefield dynamics were changing in the run-up to the US presidential elections itself. It was a clear sign that the policy of Biden and the upcoming policy of President-elect Trump would have a direct influence and impact on the course of the war. And both Russia and Ukraine were preparing for this. So as Ukraine delivered a major blow to Russia by capturing the Kursk region, Russia came up with a strategy to align with North Korea and took support from the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. North Korea had not only been supplying weapons and other logistics to Russia along with Iran and China, but North Korea even sent thousands of troops, and according to American intelligence agencies, there are 10,000 North Korean troops which have been deployed in the Kursk region of Russia, where Russia and North Korea are jointly fighting the Ukrainian occupation in order to retake the Kursk region before the start of the presidential term of the new American president. The goal of Russia was to reverse these losses. As Russia was trying to increase its territorial gain, Ukraine delivered a shock by capturing the Kursk region. But Russia alone could not push back the Ukrainian troops despite its best efforts, and it came to rely on North Korean troops, and North Korea has assisted Russia by sending at least 10,000 troops to the Kursk region, where reports indicate that Russian and North Korean troops are jointly fighting back to try and retake the Kursk region from Ukraine, so that tomorrow, that is maybe in few months, if at all a peace talk happens under the new president Donald Trump, then Russia will be in an advantageous position and Ukraine will not have any bargaining chip if it loses control over the occupied Kursk region. This has been the Russian strategy, and this is what US opposed. The Biden administration has strongly opposed the deployment of North Korean troops. The US sees this as a big escalation and the next major escalatory step in this war. So Biden administration was eager to send out a message to not just North Korea, but even to China and to Iran as well, which have been assisting Russia in this war. Because according to the Biden administration, these allies of Russia are escalating the conflict into a potential global conflict. The entry of North Korean troops marked a significant escalation, and that is what possibly explains the decision of President Biden to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles, the Army tactical missile systems, which had been secretly supplied earlier this year. As Russia and Ukraine were both trying to increase their territorial gain, US had approved the supply of the long-range missiles. And earlier this year in April, they were secretly shipped to Ukraine. Because see, these are advanced complex missile systems. They take a lot of time to be built and supplied. So US had a limited availability and some of the missile systems had been shipped. And Ukraine has some of them available in its arsenal, but it didn't have the approval to use them in the battlefield. Now the Biden administration has finally decided that the time has come to allow Ukraine to use these long-range missiles to strike deeper targets inside Russia, because Russia has carried out a big escalation in this war by bringing North Korean troops into the battlefield. So in the Kursk battlefield, North Korean troops are fighting shoulder to shoulder with Russian troops. And US sees this as a bigger escalation, as this could easily widen the conflict with possible global consequences. So this could be one of the reasons why the President Biden administration has approved the use of long-range missiles by Ukraine. The other possible reason is to basically create a hedge for US foreign policy and security interests against the erratic policies of incoming President Donald Trump. As I told you, Trump has promised to end this war and cut off support for Ukraine and even pull back support for NATO, which could end up favoring Russia. Trump has even been accused of pandering to Russian interests, even at the cost of American interests. So maybe the Biden administration is trying to put in place a plan so that at least for some months, American foreign military aid to Ukraine will continue. And before Trump takes power by January 2025, if this approval is granted, Ukraine can continue using the long-range missiles because those missiles have already been supplied under the Biden administration. So this could be Biden's way of protecting American interests as perceived by President Biden from the policies of Donald Trump, which would allow US military support to continue for some more months to Ukraine, and that apparently protects American interests. So this could be an attempt to Trump-proof US security aid and protect NATO interests and protect American interests, to ensure that Trump doesn't interfere with American and NATO military aid to Ukraine. So this is where things stand as of now. Finally, you might have one doubt, one question. If US has allowed Ukraine to use long-range missiles with a range of 300 kilometers, and if Ukraine were to use them to strike deeper targets in Russia, obviously, wouldn't this mark a big escalation? Wouldn't Russia see this as a big escalation from US? And what if Russia sees this as a breach of its red line? And could this possibly escalate the war across Europe and maybe across the world? So that is a very valid concern as well. Because earlier this year, Russian President Putin has clearly drawn the red line. Putin said that if Ukraine were to strike Russian territory with conventional missiles provided by Western nuclear powers, then Russia will treat this as a joint attack, and it will not hesitate from using nuclear weapons against Ukraine and maybe other countries if necessary to protect Russian interests. This might just be rhetoric, but definitely it marks a clear message from Russia that any supply of conventional missiles, that to long-range missiles, from Western nuclear powers to Ukraine and its usage in the battlefield against Russian military targets or civilian targets would be perceived by Russia as a big escalation, and Russia would see this as crossing a red line. Now, imagine, hypothetically, if Ukraine were now to use the missile supplied by the Biden administration, and now with the approval granted for their usage, if Ukraine were to strike deeper targets inside Russia, Russia will perceive this as a joint attack by US and Ukraine. and this will legitimately make all NATO countries a target for Russia. In fact, Russia has already been sabotaging European countries through covert intelligence operations for assisting Ukraine. So if Russia were to conclude that US and NATO are together in supporting Ukraine and supplying missiles to Ukraine, then Russia might even escalate further with a possible breakout of a bigger conflict. And you never know how the course of this war would be. And only time would tell us what exactly would be the outcome of this major decision. So one thing is very clear. The decision of Biden is indeed a major decision ever since the start of the war. This has to be one of the biggest decisions taken by the Biden administration, and it comes at the fag end of his term. So this will definitely create complications for President-elect Donald Trump, because he would inherit a complicated war, and it won't be so easy for Trump to reverse this policy and to end the war within a day as he has claimed. This also breaches a red line as far as Russia is concerned, but Biden believes that this is sending a strong message not only to Russia, but to North Korea, China, and others who are backing Russia directly in this war. So this is what we need to learn from this key development. So let's see what happens next and how the war would be influenced by this decision. So I hope the topic is clear, and if you liked and understood the discussion, please let me know in the comments. Do press the like button and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That is it. Thanks for watching.